In April 1803, in Paris, an American diplomat was asked a question he had no authority to answer. Robert Livingston had been sent to France to buy a city. One city, New Orleans, and if possible the strip of Florida coast beside it. He had been given a ceiling of $10 million and instructions that were, by the standards of the age, unusually specific. Buy the port, secure the river, come home. Instead, the French foreign minister asked him what the United States would give for the whole of Louisiana. Not the port, the whole thing. 828,000 square miles of the North American interior, stretching from the Gulf of Mexico to the Canadian border and from the Mississippi to the Rocky Mountains. Land that would eventually become 15 American states in whole or in part. Livingston had no instructions covering this. He had no authority to buy it, no idea what it was worth, and no means of asking Washington what to do, because a letter to the president and a reply back would take the better part of 4 months. He made an offer anyway. It is worth sitting with how exposed that was. Livingston had no way to verify that the offer was genuine, rather than a negotiating device. He had no way to know whether Napoleon would honor it a week later. He had no authority to commit a dollar beyond his ceiling, and every dollar above it was a personal liability in the sense that mattered to a diplomat of that era. If Washington repudiated the agreement, his career ended, and the United States was humiliated in front of Europe. He decided that the offer was real, that it would not last, and that the cost of hesitating exceeded the cost of exceeding his instructions. Then he committed his country to a sum it did not have, for a territory nobody had measured, and waited 2 months to find out whether his president agreed. What followed was the largest land transfer by purchase in recorded history, concluded in under 3 weeks by 2 men acting well beyond their brief, for a country that did not have the money, from an emperor who did not clearly own what he was selling, under a constitution that did not permit the buyer to make the purchase. And then there is the part of the story that almost never gets told, which is where the $15 million actually came from. Because the United States did not have $15 million, it did not have anything close. The federal government's entire annual revenue at the time was around $10 million. The money came from a bank in London. Which is to say, at the precise moment Britain was going back to war with France, British finance underwrote the payment that filled Napoleon's war chest. This is the story of how that happened. Start with what Jefferson actually wanted, because the modern telling makes him look far more visionary than the record supports. He was not trying to double the size of the country. He was trying to solve a specific and pressing commercial problem, and the problem was a river. In 1803, the United States stopped at the Mississippi. Everything west of it was foreign. But the country had been pushing settlers into the Ohio and Tennessee valleys for 20 years, and those settlers had a geography problem that no amount of politics could fix. There were no roads worth the name across the Appalachians. Moving a season's grain or tobacco or whiskey east over the mountains cost more than the goods were worth. So everything went downstream. Flatboats down the Ohio, into the Mississippi, and down to New Orleans, where the cargo was transferred to ocean-going ships and sold. For the entire American West, which then meant Kentucky, Tennessee, Ohio, New Orleans was not a foreign city they traded with. It was the only door out. And it belonged to Spain. It is worth knowing what New Orleans actually was in 1803, because the modern instinct is to picture a small colonial outpost, and that is wrong. It was a working port of perhaps 8,000 to 10,000 people, and the volume moving through it was enormous relative to the size of the American economy. Flour, tobacco, hemp, salted pork, lead from the Missouri diggings, furs from the upper river. the produce of an entire interior arriving on flatboats that were themselves broken up and sold for timber, because they could not be sailed back upstream against the current. Crews walked home, hundreds of miles up the Natchez Trace. The population was not American, and not really French either. It was a layered city, a French-speaking Creole elite, a Spanish colonial administration that had governed for 40 years, a large enslaved population, and an unusually substantial community of free people of color with property and standing that had no equivalent anywhere in the United States. Its legal system was continental, not English common law, a distinction that survives in Louisiana's civil code today. So when the Americans talked about buying New Orleans, they were not talking about acquiring a village with a good harbor. They were talking about buying the choke point of a continental river system and inheriting a city that would be, on the day of transfer, one of the more significant and least American places in the United States. The arrangement had held because of a treaty signed in 1795, which gave Americans what was called the right of deposit, the right to bring goods down the river, offload them at New Orleans, and store them there while waiting for a ship without paying duty. It was a technical provision in a minor treaty, and it was, in practical terms, the economic constitution of half the country. In October 1802, the Spanish administrator at New Orleans revoked it. The effect was immediate. Produce piled up on the levee with nowhere to go. Prices collapsed in Kentucky and Tennessee. And the political reaction in the West was not measured. There was open talk of raising a militia, taking New Orleans by force, and presenting Washington with the result. Some of that talk came from men in Congress. Then came worse news. Spain had not simply changed its mind. Spain had secretly transferred Louisiana back to France in 1800, in a treaty at San Ildefonso that Washington had only heard rumors of. The revocation of the right of deposit was the visible edge of a much larger fact. The entire western frontier of the United States was about to be handed from a weak, declining Spain to the most aggressive military power on earth. Jefferson understood exactly what that meant. He wrote that the day France took possession of New Orleans, the United States would have to marry itself to the British fleet, an extraordinary thing for him to write, given that he had spent his political life as the most pro-French figure in American politics. So he sent James Monroe to Paris to join Livingston, with authority to spend up to $10 million on New Orleans and the Floridas. If France refused, they were to cross to London and open talks about an alliance. That is the whole of the American ambition in the spring of 1803. A port, a river mouth, and a strip of coast. Nobody in Washington was contemplating the purchase of a continent. Which raises the real question of this story. Why did Napoleon offer one? The conventional answer is that he needed money for the coming war with Britain, and that is true but incomplete. The fuller answer involves an island, a disease, and the most consequential military defeat of his career, one that is barely mentioned in most accounts of his life. France's interest in Louisiana was never really about Louisiana. It was about Saint-Domingue. Saint-Domingue, the western third of the island of Hispaniola, today Haiti, was the single most profitable colony in the world. Not one of the most profitable, the most. Its sugar and coffee plantations produced a substantial share of the world's supply and generated more wealth for France than every other French possession combined. That wealth rested entirely on the labor of enslaved people, held in conditions so lethal that the population had to be continuously replenished by the slave trade to be maintained at all. In 1791, the enslaved population revolted. The revolution that followed ran for over a decade, through the collapse of French royal authority, through British and Spanish invasions, and through the rise of Toussaint Louverture, who by 1801 governed the colony in all but name. The man who broke that system deserves more than a passing mention, because his decisions determined the map of the United States more directly than any American's. Toussaint Louverture had been born into slavery on a plantation in the north of the colony and was freed in his 30s. When the revolt began, he was around 50, an age at which most men's lives are settled, and he emerged from it as the most capable general in the Caribbean. What made him formidable was not battlefield brilliance alone. It was that he understood the strategic position better than the Europeans did. He allied with Spain against France, then switched to France when France abolished slavery in 1794, then expelled the British when they invaded, then governed the colony as a French officer while conducting foreign policy as though he headed a state. He negotiated trade agreements with the United States and with Britain directly. By 1801, he had promulgated a constitution for the colony that abolished slavery permanently, declared himself governor for life, and gave France no meaningful role in its administration. It did not formally declare independence. In every practical respect, it announced it. Napoleon's response was the expedition, and its stated purpose was not initially the restoration of slavery. That was concealed, because admitting it would have united the entire population against the landing. Toussaint was eventually taken by a ruse, invited to a meeting under a guarantee of safe conduct, seized and shipped to France. He was imprisoned in a fortress in the Jura Mountains at altitude in winter, and died there in April 1803, the same month, as it happens, that the Louisiana negotiation was taking place in Paris. He did not live to see either outcome, but the resistance he had built outlived him, and it was that resistance, combined with the fever, that destroyed the expedition. Jean-Jacques Dessalines completed what Toussaint had begun and declared independence on the 1st of January, 1804. There is a line of causation here that is worth stating plainly, because it is usually left implicit. The largest expansion of the United States was made possible by the successful revolt of enslaved people against a European empire. Napoleon sold Louisiana because he had lost Haiti. Had the expedition succeeded, the French-American Empire proceeds as planned. Louisiana stays French, and the map of North America is a different map entirely. Louisiana's role in French strategy was to be the granary that fed Saint-Domingue. The Mississippi Valley would grow the food, the island would grow the sugar, the system would sustain a French empire in the Americas. Louisiana was the supporting act. So in late 1801, Napoleon sent an expedition to retake the island, under General Charles Leclerc, his brother-in-law. It was not a small force. Over the course of the campaign, France committed tens of thousands of troops, one of the largest expeditionary efforts of the era. It was destroyed, partly by the resistance, which was ferocious and well led, but mostly by yellow fever. European soldiers arriving in the Caribbean had no immunity, and the disease moved through the expedition in waves. Leclerc himself died of it in November 1802. The scale of the loss is genuinely difficult to comprehend. The great majority of the men sent never came home, and most of them were killed by mosquitoes rather than by any human enemy. By the beginning of 1803, Napoleon understood that Saint-Domingue was gone. The colony declared independence as Haiti at the end of 1803. And the moment the island was lost, Louisiana became worthless to France. Understand what it was without Saint-Domingue. An enormous, largely unmapped territory, thinly held, thousands of miles from France, with no significant French population, reachable only by sea lanes the Royal Navy could close at will. It could not be defended. It generated no revenue. and war with Britain was weeks away. The Peace of Amiens was collapsing and would formally end in May 1803. In a war with Britain, Louisiana was not an asset. It was a liability that would be captured at no cost to Britain the moment fighting began. Napoleon would lose it anyway and get nothing for it. Seen that way, the decision to sell is not a blunder or a stroke of American luck. It is the correct reading of a bad position. He held an asset he could not defend, could not use, and was about to lose. There was exactly one buyer, and that buyer had a specific and urgent reason to pay. He sold it to the only party who could not take it from him by force. The negotiation itself was extraordinarily fast. On the 11th of April, 1803, Talleyrand put the question to Livingston: what would the United States give for the whole of Louisiana? Livingston, entirely without instructions, suggested a figure. Monroe arrived the following day. The actual bargaining was handled on the French side by François Barbé-Marbois, the finance minister, who was more straightforward than Talleyrand and who Napoleon appears to have trusted with the numbers. The French opened at a figure the Americans could not contemplate. The Americans countered. Within a fortnight they had settled. The final price was $15 million, structured in two parts. $11.25 million was payment to France for the territory. The remaining $3.75 million was the United States assuming the claims of its own citizens against the French government. Debts France owed to American merchants for ships and cargo seized during the undeclared naval conflict of the late 1790s. That second portion cost France nothing in cash. It simply transferred an obligation it was not paying anyway. The treaty was signed on the 30th of April, 1803, and backdated. Livingston, who had spent years achieving nothing in Paris, and then in 3 weeks acquired a continent, is recorded as saying that from that day the United States would take its place among the powers of the first rank. He was aware, correctly, that he had just done the most important thing he would ever do. He was also aware that he had done it without permission. Which brings us to the constitutional problem, and it is a genuine one, not a footnote. Thomas Jefferson had built his entire political career on a specific reading of the Constitution, that the federal government possessed only those powers explicitly granted to it, and that any power not written down did not exist. He had used this argument to oppose Hamilton's National Bank. He had used it repeatedly against the Federalists. It was not a convenient position. It was the organizing principle of his party. The Constitution does not grant the federal government the power to purchase foreign territory. It is not there. There is no clause. Jefferson knew this immediately, and it troubled him seriously. He drafted a constitutional amendment to authorize the acquisition retrospectively. He circulated it. He argued for it. And then he dropped it because he was told, plausibly, that Napoleon might change his mind, and that the months required to pass an amendment were months the offer might not survive. So the strictest constructionist in American politics executed the largest expansion of federal power in the country's history, on the basis that the Constitution's treaty-making clause could probably be read broadly enough to cover it. His own private correspondence shows him uncomfortable about this for years afterwards. The opposition it produced is worth examining, because it was more serious than the eventual vote suggests. The Federalists, the party of Hamilton, Adams, and New England commerce, attacked the purchase on 3 grounds, and only one of them was the constitutional argument. The second was fiscal. $15 million was a colossal sum against a federal revenue of 10 or 11 million. Jefferson had come to office promising to reduce the national debt, cut the Army and Navy, and shrink the government. He was now proposing to roughly double the outstanding debt in a single transaction, for territory nobody had surveyed. Set aside the politics, and that is a reasonable objection from anyone who took the debt seriously. The third was the one that actually mattered to them, and it was sectional arithmetic. New England's political weight depended on its share of a fixed-size country. Every state carved out of the West would send senators, and those senators would not be from New England. The purchase guaranteed the permanent, structural decline of New England's influence in the federal government, not through any policy, simply through the addition of land. Some Federalists said so openly. There was talk in New England of a Northern Confederacy, of secession, seriously discussed among senior figures, on the basis that a republic stretching to the Rockies was not the republic they had signed up to, and that their region would be governed by strangers. The plotting came to nothing, partly because Alexander Hamilton would not support it, but it was real, and it is a useful corrective to the idea that the purchase was universally celebrated. Timothy Pickering, a senator from Massachusetts and a former Secretary of State, was among those who considered separation preferable. That is not a fringe figure. The Senate ratified in October 1803 by 24 votes to 7. The margin was comfortable because Jefferson's party held the chamber, not because the objections had been answered. They had simply been outvoted, and the objectors were right about the consequence even though they lost the argument. New England's relative power did decline permanently from that moment. Now to the part of this story that gets left out of every school textbook, which is how it was paid for. The United States in 1803 had annual federal revenue of roughly $10 to $11 million, drawn almost entirely from customs duties. The purchase price was $15 million. There was no mechanism by which the Treasury could produce that sum in cash, and Napoleon was not interested in installments spread over a decade. He was about to fight Britain, and he wanted money now. So the United States did what a government does when it needs money it does not have. It issued bonds as 6% stock, redeemable over 15 years. But a bond is only money if somebody buys it. And in 1803, the United States was a 20-year-old republic with a checkered credit history, no central bank of the kind Europe understood, and a currency nobody in Paris wanted. The market for American government debt was not in America, it was in Europe. The bonds were taken up by two houses, Baring Brothers of London and Hope and Company of Amsterdam. Alexander Baring traveled to Paris personally to arrange it. The structure was straightforward in outline. The American bonds were delivered to the bankers paid France, and the bankers then held or placed the debt with European investors, taking their profit on the discount. France did not receive $15 million in cash. It received a substantially smaller sum, paid promptly, which is what it actually wanted. The reported figure is in the region of $8 to $9 million delivered to the French Treasury. It is worth slowing down on who these houses were, because they are the actual protagonists of the financial half of this story, and almost nobody knows their names. Baring Brothers had been founded in London in the 1760s by the sons of a German cloth merchant who had settled in Exeter. By 1803, it was among the most powerful private banks in the world, the house that governments went to when they needed to raise money across borders. Its business was sovereign lending, taking the debt of states, placing it with investors, and taking a cut of the difference. A generation later, a French statesman would describe the six great powers of Europe as England, France, Prussia, Austria, Russia, and Baring Brothers, and it was not entirely a joke. Hope and Company of Amsterdam was older still, and had been the dominant house in European sovereign finance for much of the 18th century. Amsterdam was where continental capital pooled, and hope was where it was directed. The two houses had worked together before and were closely linked. The Napoleonic disruption of Amsterdam had pushed a good deal of Hope's business toward London. Alexander Baring, the son of the founder, was the one who traveled to Paris to close the arrangement. He was in his late 20s. He also had a personal stake in American matters that is worth knowing. He had spent time in the United States in the 1790s, had bought a very large tract of land in Maine, and had married the daughter of a Philadelphia senator. He was not a neutral banker looking at an unfamiliar country. He knew the American credit position firsthand, which is precisely why he was willing to take the paper when others might not have been. The mechanics were these. The United States issued 6% stock. Baring and Hope took the bonds at a discount. The reported terms put it around 78.5 cents on the dollar. They then paid France in cash and placed the American debt with European investors over the following years. Read that structure carefully, because it explains the gap between the price and the payment. France was not paid $15 million. France was paid what the bonds fetched at a discount promptly, in a form it could spend, something in the region of $8 to $9 million. The remaining value went in the discount to the bankers and in the assumed claims. The United States, meanwhile, owed the full face amount plus 15 years of interest. That spread is the banker's return, and it was substantial. It is also exactly what a sovereign borrower pays when it needs a very large sum quickly, has no domestic capital market to draw on, and has only one realistic set of counterparties. The United States was not cheated. The terms were normal for the period and the position. But it is worth being clear that the celebrated 3 cents an acre was a price agreed between governments, and that a considerable amount of value was distributed to private houses in the course of turning that price into money. Now consider the date. Britain and France returned to war in May 1803, the same month the ink dried on the treaty. Baring Brothers was a British bank, operating in London, under a British government that was mobilizing for a war it expected to be existential. And that bank was, in effect, handing Napoleon Bonaparte a large sum of ready cash at the moment he needed it to prosecute that war. The British government knew. Baring sought and obtained the approval of the Prime Minister, Henry Addington, before proceeding. The reasoning was strategic rather than sentimental. British ministers had concluded that a Louisiana in French hands was a permanent threat, that a Louisiana in American hands was a commercial opportunity and a strategic irrelevance, and that removing France from the North American mainland was worth more than the cash was worth to Napoleon's war effort. That may well have been correct. It is also one of the more remarkable decisions in financial history, a wartime government permitting its own bankers to fund its enemy, because the thing being bought was worth more than the money being paid. And it is worth asking what Napoleon actually did with it, because the answer sharpens the irony considerably. The money arrived as he was assembling the Armée d'Angleterre, the Army of England, on the Channel coast around Boulogne. Through 1803 and 1804, he concentrated well over 100,000 men there, together with a flotilla of flat-bottomed invasion craft built specifically to cross the Channel and land them in Kent. It was the most serious invasion threat Britain had faced since 1588, and it was taken entirely seriously at the time. Britain built the Martello Towers along the south coast and the Royal Military Canal in direct response. So the sequence is this. A London bank, with the written approval of the British Prime Minister, delivered cash to Napoleon in 1803. Napoleon spent that period building an army and a fleet whose declared purpose was the invasion of Britain. It never came. The invasion was abandoned in 1805 when the naval position made it impossible, and Trafalgar settled the question in October of that year. But nobody in 1803 knew that it would fail, and the British government approved the transaction anyway. That is either an extraordinary piece of strategic clarity, accepting a short-term risk to permanently remove France from North America, or an extraordinary piece of luck that has been retrospectively dressed up as judgment. The honest answer is probably that it was both, and that the distinction only becomes visible after the fact. There was one more problem, and it is almost comic. Nobody could say what had been bought. The treaty described the territory as having the same extent that it now has in the hands of Spain, and that it had when France possessed it. That is not a boundary, it is a shrug in legal form. Livingston asked Talleyrand directly what the eastern and western limits were. Talleyrand's reply has been repeated ever since, and it is worth quoting because it tells you exactly how the French regarded the transaction. He said that he could not give them a better direction than they already had, and that he supposed they would make the most of it. He was telling the Americans, in the politest possible terms, that France was selling a claim of undefined extent and had no intention of clarifying it. Whatever they could subsequently argue for, they were welcome to argue for. That vagueness produced decades of dispute. Did the purchase include West Florida, the Gulf Coast strip running east from New Orleans? The United States said yes, and eventually simply occupied it. Spain said no, and was in a poor position to insist. Where was the western limit? The treaty implied the watershed of the Mississippi, which meant the boundary depended on hydrology that had not been surveyed. The line with Spanish territory in the southwest was not settled until 1819, and the northern boundary with British North America not until 1818. Spain, meanwhile, protested the sale outright. When France had acquired Louisiana at San Ildefonso in 1800, it had undertaken not to transfer the territory to any third power. Selling it to the United States 3 years later was, on the face of it, a breach of that undertaking. The Spanish government said so formally. It made no difference. Spain lacked the means to contest it, and France was not interested in the argument. The transaction proceeded over a valid objection from the party that had handed the territory over in the first place, which is a reasonable summary of how international law functioned when one participant had the largest army in Europe. The handover itself, when it came, was one of the stranger ceremonies in American history. Spain had never actually vacated. France had acquired Louisiana on paper in 1800, but had never taken possession. The Spanish colonial administration simply carried on. So before the United States could take control, France had to receive the territory it had already sold. In late November 1803, at New Orleans, the Spanish flag came down and the French flag went up, and a French official took possession of a colony his government had disposed of 7 months earlier. 20 days later, on the 20th of December, the French flag came down and the American flag went up. 3 sovereigns in under 3 weeks, for a territory none of them had surveyed, in a city whose population, French, Spanish, African, Creole, few of them consulted, woke up American without having moved. The arithmetic afterwards is worth setting out properly, because the famous figure is misleading. $15 million for 828,000 square miles works out at roughly 3 cents an acre. That is the number everybody quotes. But $15 million was the price, not the cost. The bonds carried 6% interest over 15 years, and by the time the debt was fully retired, the United States had paid out something in the region of $23 million, and by some accountings higher. So the real figure is closer to 4 or 5 cents an acre, which does not change the conclusion in the slightest. At any of those numbers it remains, in pure price per value terms, the most advantageous transaction the United States has ever made. The territory contained the Great Plains, the Missouri River system, the port of New Orleans, and beneath a portion of it, though nobody knew or cared in 1803, a great deal of oil. There was then the question of what to do with the people, and it exposed something awkward about the whole enterprise. The treaty committed the United States to admitting the inhabitants as soon as possible, according to the principles of the federal Constitution, to the enjoyment of all the rights, advantages, and immunities of citizens. That is a promise of citizenship, written into a binding international agreement. It was not kept promptly. Congress divided the purchase in 1804 into the territory of Orleans in the south and the District of Louisiana to the north, and governed Orleans through an appointed governor and an appointed council, no elected legislature at all in the first instance. The residents of New Orleans, who included men of property, education, and considerable commercial sophistication, found themselves with less say in their own government than they had enjoyed under Spain. They petitioned. A delegation went to Washington in 1804 carrying a formal remonstrance, pointing out with some precision that they had been promised the rights of citizens and had been given an administration they did not choose, conducted in a language most of them did not speak, under a legal system foreign to the one they had used all their lives. It worked slowly. An elected legislature followed in 1805, and Louisiana became a state in 1812, the first carved out of the purchase. But the episode is worth noting because it is the first time the United States had to work out what to do with a large population acquired rather than settled. Every previous expansion had been into land the government regarded, however inaccurately, as available. This was different. A functioning society with its own laws, language, and elite, transferred by treaty between two other powers, and then governed by a republic whose founding argument had been that government requires the consent of the governed. The people of New Orleans were not asked. Nor, needless to say, were the many thousands of enslaved people in the territory, whose status the purchase simply carried forward, or the indigenous nations across the whole of the interior. Jefferson, to his credit, understood that he had bought something nobody could describe, and moved immediately to find out what it was. He had actually asked Congress for money to explore the Missouri in January 1803, months before the purchase was even contemplated, in a confidential message, on the basis that it would be a commercial expedition into what was then foreign territory. Congress approved a modest sum. By the time Meriwether Lewis and William Clark set out in 1804, the land they were sent to examine had become American, and the mission had changed from reconnaissance of a neighbor into a survey of property. They were gone until 1806. What they brought back was the first systematic account of the interior, river systems, mountain passes, distances, the nations who lived there, and the confirmation of something Jefferson had privately hoped was false, that there was no easy water route to the Pacific. The Rockies were not a ridge to be crossed in a day. The continent was much harder country than the purchase had assumed. That expedition is usually told as an adventure. It is more useful to see it as due diligence conducted after settlement, the buyer surveying the asset 2 years after paying for it, and discovering that the geography did not match the assumptions used to justify the price. There is also a consequence of this purchase that took 60 years to detonate, and it belongs in the story. Louisiana was not simply land. It was future states, and every future state would eventually have to answer a question the Constitution had deliberately left unresolved. Would slavery be permitted there? Before 1803, that question had natural limits, because the country had a finite amount of territory and a rough balance between the sections. The purchase removed the limit. It created an enormous reserve of unorganized land, and it guaranteed that every decade for the next half-century American politics would have to fight over the status of the next piece of it. The Missouri Compromise of 1820 was the first attempt to settle it, admitting Missouri as a slave state, Maine as a free one, and drawing a line across the remaining Louisiana territory above which slavery would be excluded. That line held for 34 years and was then destroyed by the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854, which reopened territory the compromise had closed and produced armed conflict in Kansas that is reasonably regarded as the opening phase of the Civil War. None of that was foreseen in 1803, and it would be unfair to say Jefferson should have foreseen it. But it is the largest single consequence of the transaction, and it is not the one the 3 cents an acre figure captures. He bought the territory that made the sectional crisis unavoidable. And there is a harder point that belongs in an honest account. The land was not empty. It was occupied by many nations of indigenous people whose presence, claims, and sovereignty formed no part of the negotiation whatsoever. What France sold and the United States bought was not the land itself, but a European claim to it, the exclusive right, as against other European powers, to acquire it. Every actual acquisition of the ground came afterwards, through treaties made under pressure, through purchase, and through force over the following century. The 3 cents an acre bought the right to begin that process without a European rival interfering. It did not buy the ground. The ground was taken separately, and the people living on it paid a price that appears nowhere in the 15 million. It is also worth putting the 15 million into some kind of proportion, because the number is meaningless in isolation. Against federal revenue of roughly 10 to 11 million a year, the purchase was about 1.5 years of the entire income of the United States government. Applied to a modern government at similar proportions, it would be a transaction running into trillions. Against the national debt, which stood somewhere around $80 million, it was an increase of nearly 20% in a single stroke, by a president elected on a promise to pay the debt down. And against what else was available to buy, $15 million in 1803 would have built a very substantial navy. The frigates that had been constructed in the 1790s, the ships that made the American Navy respectable, including the Constitution, had cost in the region of $300,000 each. 15 million was, very roughly, an entire fleet. That comparison is the one that makes the decision look sharpest in hindsight. Jefferson chose territory over force. He bought the thing that could not be taken from him later rather than the thing that could be sunk. Given that he was also busy cutting the navy he already had, the choice was consistent with his instincts as well as, in the event, correct. Whether he saw it that clearly at the time is another matter. He had authorized 10 million for a city and got a continent for 15, which is less a strategy than an opportunity taken quickly by men who could not consult him. So what is the lesson for a channel about how money shapes countries? The first is about timing, and it is the least comfortable. The United States did not get this territory because it was strong, wealthy, or clever. It got it because, for a window of a few months, a stronger power urgently needed cash and held an asset it could not defend. Napoleon did not underestimate the value of Louisiana. He correctly estimated that he was going to lose it. America's advantage was not power. It was being the only available counterparty at the moment the seller was forced. The second is about credit, and it is the one that matters most. Jefferson's party had spent a decade attacking Hamilton's financial architecture, the funding of the national debt, the bank, the whole apparatus of public credit. In 1803, that architecture was the only reason the purchase was possible. American bonds were saleable in London and Amsterdam because Hamilton had spent the 1790s establishing that the United States paid its debts. Without that reputation, built deliberately and at political cost by a man Jefferson despised, there is no financing, and without financing there is no purchase. The party that opposed public credit doubled the country using it. And the third is the one that recurs through every story on this channel. The decisive actors were not the governments. Two banking houses, one in London and one in Amsterdam, determined whether the largest land transfer in history could be completed, and one of them was operating from the capital of a nation at war with the recipient of the money. Governments made the decision. Finance determined whether the decision was possible. That order of operations has not changed since.